From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland, from sea to shining sea. This is Wehman Brunson and Vernuccio Inside the News.
Welcome back to another fascinating week right here on Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. We got our guys with us, Frank Vernuccio and Ben Brunson. Let's say hello to Frank Vernuccio up in there in the Empire State. How you doing, Frank?
Greetings from New York that has all the heat of Florida, but none of the palm trees are charmed.
All right, Ben Brunson in Florida. How you doing, Ben?
Still in North Carolina, so it's a little cooler than it otherwise would be.
All right, well, let's get started here. And if you haven't guessed already, the topic of the day, we're going to start with the assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. Normally, we go to Frank to start off our first segment, but Ben, you have dibs. Go.
Yeah, an amazing day, of course, Saturday, as these events unfolded. And I'm going to start by stepping back from our usual secular scientific analysis that we try to engage in and say, as a Christian, that I think the hand of God protected Donald Trump on that afternoon. And but let's talk about how it could be that a guy could set up with an AR at the obvious spot 130 yards away from the president and take a shot with all this security around. And I'm going to go with the charitable explanation that this is just part and parcel of the rank incompetence of this administration from A to Z, from the top down through every level. There's nothing but incompetence. Keep in mind that the Secret Service is under Mayorkas, and it's hard to imagine a bigger incompetent than Mayorkas, but the Secret Service head, Kim Cheadle, is a DEI hire. Her second in command's a DEI hire. There's nothing but an emphasis on DEI over competence, and it shows through everything this administration does. You're sitting there, as the facts come out, we realize that police were concerned about this guy a half hour before he pulled the trigger. So he was on the radar of local police. You have a scenario where the Secret Service is in charge of the president's security, but they, as they always have, rely on state, city, and local police departments to augment their force and augment their capabilities. But keep in mind, the Secret Service is responsible. They're responsible for coordinating. They're responsible for making sure that every obvious targeting platform is covered, is reviewed, is locked down. But there's one interesting thing here that's coming out, and that it appears that the guy went on top of a roof directly above where an authorized Butler County Police kind of sniper team had set up in the building right underneath. So when you look at the video of the police counter snipers that are behind Trump, who apparently have the would-be assassin in their crosshairs for at least 40 seconds prior to the guy pulling the trigger, you have to recognize, I think, and again, this goes to the incompetence of the whole lack of command and control over the whole situation. But you have to recognize that what those guys thought was, well, that guy is directly at a spot where we expect an authorized police sniper team to be located. And he's on the roof, which, wouldn't be surprising, just as those guys were on the roof of the building behind Trump. So I'm sure they're sitting there working their handhelds and trying to figure out, hey, is this guy part of a police unit or not? Unfortunately, they couldn't make that decision prior to the guy pulling the trigger. And by the grace of God, even though 130 yards for any decent person, any person with decent rifle skills is a relatively easy shot, thankfully that guy just grazed Trump's ear. And God bless the family of the fire chief who was killed protecting his family, and God be with the other two who are wounded.
All right, let's bring in Frank Vernuccio with the American Analysis of News and Media. Frank, let's get your analysis. Go.
I think Ben put it pretty succinctly. It was obvious. If you were the gentleman with your finger on the trigger in the Secret Service, it's easy to say in retrospect, why didn't he shoot this guy? But if you're the guy with the finger on the trigger, is this a cop that I'm looking at? Is it one of us? Taking someone else's life is not a decision you make lightly. The problem was in the communication between the local Leos and the Secret Service. That was the issue. And that's where the incompetence comes in. You would think that a presidential candidate's appearance, particularly one as controversial as Donald Trump, would be choreographed more carefully than the most intense ballet. And yet, in this case, it seems the local police were doing their thing, the Secret Service was doing their thing, and they didn't cooperate with each other or really communicate with each other in an effective manner. I can't fault the individual in the Secret Service who had his finger on the trigger, pointing at this guy, thinking that he was possibly the local Leo. That doesn't make any sense that this wasn't coordinated. We will have this person on this roof at this time. Don't worry about him. He's one of us. That communication never took place. But there's more to it as well. When you look at the people surrounding the president, Donald Trump's not a short guy. He's about 6'2", I believe. You would assume that logic dictates that the people whose job was it to thrust their body in front of the president in the case of an assassination attempt would be at least his height or taller. And it seems that the people around Donald Trump were shorter than he was. That didn't make much sense either. So I think there's a lot of screw ups here, some of it in communication, and some of it, I think, provoked by DEI considerations. Just as DEI is destroying American corporations, just as it's destroying the American economy, it almost led to the death of a presidential candidate. I want to do one other point. This illustrates something that this administration has done, which is unforgivable. I'm not a supporter of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at all. I don't think he's a great candidate. I think his policies are pretty stupid for the most part, but he's a legitimate candidate for the presidency of the United States of America. He's had both his father and his uncle assassinated. He has had his home violated, nearly violated by folks trying to break in. Joe Biden, because he sees RFK as a potential threat to his candidacy, refuses to grant Secret Service protection to him, literally inviting another assassination. It gets worse than that. If you look at the way the Democratic primary was set up, it was set up specifically to prevent another candidate from having a fair chance. You know, we talk about Donald Trump being a threat to democracy, some folks say. Well, that's sheer nonsense. You look at his 4 years of the presidency, he's probably the most transparent president in history. But you look at the 4 years of Joe Biden, and you have never seen an administration play more fast and loose with the law, play more fast and loose with the Constitution. This is the real threat to democracy, a continuation of a Democratic presidency that has nothing but contempt for the law, the Constitution, and democracy itself.
All right. I guess I've got to take a little bit of exception because these guys, they had him in his sight, and they knew about 30 minutes, 3 minutes. They had plenty of time to understand if this guy was law, if they were, you know, a police official or not, or if he was something else. And I think that they did determine it was maybe something else. The one sniper who took him out was told to stand down for about 3 minutes. He says, "I've got him." They said, "Stand down. We don't want you to take him." You have one goal, and that is to protect the principle that you're there to guard, and that is Donald Trump. Now, even if you make the mistake, you take the guy out and then you take the hit later on, as far as, you know, the political hit or whatever, because your only goal is to protect Donald Trump, which is the principal at that point. It could have been Joe Biden as the principal. It could have been Jill or Flotus. I mean, any of those people could have been the principal that you're the guard. And at that point in time, you've got a couple of options. You take out what you think is the threat, boom. And I know you disagree, but
I think you're missing the other quite obvious option, which again, incompetently was not taken. You have a guy on a roof. You have him in the crosshairs of your counter snipers. You're not sure if that's an LEO or not, if that's an authorized policeman or not. And it's a hell of a thing to shoot another police officer in that situation. But there's another obvious option. You get Donald Trump off the dais into a protected spot until you resolve who this person is with an AR 130 yards away.
Yeah. So now why did he even take the stage to begin with? There you go.
Well, again, regardless of that, he should have been, as soon as they realized they had a situation where they're not sure who this guy is with a rifle that's pointed in Trump's direction, get Trump out of there.
Yes.
Resolve who this guy is, one way or the other, and then let Trump resume his rally. I mean, that's the obvious way to handle it. But you have to have leadership. You have to have someone in charge. This whole thing was a breakdown of incompetence. The Secret Service is in charge of the entire area. They have to know exactly each other. If it's done correctly, they have to vet every officer who's going to be at that scene. Because you never know, there could be a sworn LEO who's part of a local sniper team who hates Donald Trump with a passion. So you have to vet the officers who are coming. There's a lot of work to do this properly, and it's quite obvious. The one thing we can say for sure that we all agree on is this was not done properly or competently. And again, I come down to this is just another example of the gross rank incompetence, whether you're talking about Blinken or Mayorkas or any member of this cabinet or administration. There's nothing but incompetence from A to Z, and it starts at the top, and it's the tone set by the commander-in-chief, who is dementia-riddled incompetent to start with. So we almost paid a huge price, and by the grace of God, we're going to have the opposite outcome. This is going to ensure that Donald Trump is our next president.
DHS is in charge of Secret Service. It used to be the Department of Treasury was in charge of Secret Service at one point in time, and we didn't hear much of these problems back then. Let's go back to Kimberly Cheadle. She's the director of the Secret Service. They ought to demand and get her resignation immediately. She came from Pepsi Corporation. I mean, what are we doing? Guarding Mountain Dews and oatmeals and Frito-Lays? No, this is people. And she is totally incompetent. You mentioned DEI. You've got this gal who's 5'7", cannot get her gun in her holster. And that was she tried 3 or 4 or 5 times. That's like Primo 1. When you go to any gun range, that's the first thing you do is do that.
And Guy, on that point, that is a pure reflection of how many hours of training you have.
Exactly.
You get to 1,000 hours of training, and that is muscle memory. You can do it in your sleep, get that pistol back in its holster. What that tells me is a lot. It tells me that woman is a recent hire to the Secret Service.
Yep.
And she's put on the detail for the number 2 protectee in the world right now. Number 1 is, of course, Joe Biden. Number 2 is Donald Trump. And they're taking a rookie or someone with very limited experience and obviously very, very limited training and putting that person on the detail for Donald Trump. It is, again, the Secret Service does a million things. So they have agents all over. It is supposed to be the very experienced and best agents who get on the presidential details.
Yes.
And this just goes hand in hand with just how horrible this administration is. Everything they touch is a disaster, everything. And this is an example of exactly how bad that is.
All right, let's get Frank into here before we close out this segment. Frank, go.
One of the things we have to look at is the reaction of the media, and it really displays a lot. The first response from CNN, despite the fact that everyone knew what was going on, that there was an assassination attempt at the president was knocked down to prevent him from being shot. CNN reports that President Trump fell on the stage. This was the initial reaction by CNN, an outright, blatant, and obvious lie. This exposes the extent to which the media is going to warp this election. If you look at some of the foreign press, I, for example, looked at some UK papers the morning after the assassination attempt, they displayed a contempt for much of the American media, how ridiculously this was reported, in particular CNN. We also remember the next day that the CNN took Morning Joe off the air because they knew those folks, the two hosts of Morning Joe, were so absurd in their comments about Donald Trump that they frankly were afraid they would look ridiculous before an audience that already, frankly, is ridiculous for watching a show like that.
Yeah, we could. That's a whole nother segment in itself. And if they had to take them out of there, that means they don't trust those hosts, which means they have no business hosting a show on a major network. And that's what that tells me, too. We've got so much world reaction. Eileen Cannon, we've got a lot on this week's show. Stay with us. This is Wehman Brunson Vernuccio Inside the News. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman Brunson and Vernuccio Inside the News.